Hello and welcome to part 2 of chapter 2 of Kotler's and Keller's Developing Marketing Strategies and Plans. After we go about and decide and consider the mission statement and we start putting together the strategies, a critical part of our overall planning is assessing the growth opportunities within the particular scope of the businesses in which we work in. And when we're assessing the growth opportunities, usually you're looking at 4 possible growth opportunities that we look at. There's the concept of intensive growth, there's integrative growth, my English not great, and diversification growth. And then the last is whether or not the organizations have businesses in which it is time to consider downsizing and divesting. All right? So let's look at these one at a time. Intensive growth is when in an existing market and with existing process, you want to be able to improve your existing businesses. And hopefully what you want to do is that perhaps you want to be able to gain more market share in a given market, okay? This is known by the other Satoism as the penetration strategy. It quite simply means that you want to sell more, all right? In a penetration strategy, basically, as I've said before, it's the desire to take a product and sell more of. What is the quickest way that you can do this? Well, there's really one simple way to do it. You cut costs, you cut prices, all right? Of the 4 P's, and it's important to note, price is the easiest to change. You simply reduce the prices on your goods, and generally through supply and demand, you find that you will sell more. It's a very dangerous strategy because if you think about it, of course, is that if you reduce prices, the odds are is that your overall revenues will suffer. However, if market share is your goal, then yes, it's a way of doing it. The other ways, instead of cutting prices, is to increase costs, such as going into a strategy of adding advertisements, investing more in social media, and those are ways of penetrating a new market, the existing market with the same products and selling more. The next is to decide whether you want to develop new markets for your current products. So let's give an example. If we were talking about Starbucks again, Starbucks, of course, started in Seattle. It started with one individual coffee shop, and they worked very much on putting together, a marketing plan. And so the next phase in the market development was quite simply to take that overall package and open it in multiple locations. And so this is the market development strategy. You take the same products and you go to a new market. And of course, Starbucks expanded across the United States this way, and to the point where in many ways you don't actually have to say it achieved saturation. It went over saturation. They accept cannibalism of their sales from one Starbucks to another as what they consider to be an acceptable business strategy. But eventually what happens is you fill up, all right? You basically run out of markets in which to expand to, and then what you do is you create what's known as the product development strategy. And so in product development strategy, you stay in the existing markets and you create new products. And so the example, of course, with Starbucks is that once it expanded across the United States, is that it started selling things like breakfast items. And you started to see them try to do things like biscuits and those kind of things. And it took it took a decade for them to really figure out what is the better way of doing that. Because one of the difficulties is that the smell of biscuits, and this was noted by many consumers, kind of spoiled the ambiance of going inside of a Starbucks. But what happened is they added products in the existing markets, and Starbucks did grow. All right. And if you look also, beyond just merely the coffee and the pastries that they sell, they started selling CDs, they started selling coffee mugs. All of those things, in essence, expanded the number of things that they could sell. Finally, what they do is they create new products for new markets in what's known as a diversification strategy. And so think of that, new products in new markets. And so Starbucks, in essence, has expanded as far as they possibly could in the stores that they have in the United States. And so what was the next step? Well, the next step was to find them in the supermarkets, in the grocery aisles, and to find them in the coolers where you found, coffees not only on the shelves where all the other coffees are, but then you saw cold drinks and those kind of things. I saw this in an AutoZone, and I thought it was brilliant. In an AutoZone, you found one of those little small coolers that are about half the size, and in there it was a cooler full of Starbucks products. And I thought that was genius. I mean, it really is. It in essence pushes Starbucks products into a market that may not necessarily be considered a Starbucks kind of clientele, but from what I saw, they were doing pretty well. And so that is an example of a diversification strategy that took it one step further and has achieved some success. And so this is intensive growth. The next is the concept of integrative growth, all right? And this is when businesses can increase sales through forward or backward or horizontal integration within their industry. And so an example of what I mean is Chrysler in 2009 was going through their particular issues, and they found that they had a partner who was willing to share with them in Fiat. And so Fiat bought into the Chrysler Corporation, and this is an example of integrative growth. Fiat got all of the products, or let's just say the automobiles that Chrysler has, and then by the very same token, Chrysler got the automobiles that Fiat has. And that is an example of reaching into markets that you wouldn't necessarily be able to be into, but by integrating two corporations together. Other deals that don't necessarily require the merging of two corporations, you also find joint ventures. And these are where two corporations will come together, such as Merck joining with Johnson & Johnson to sell over-the-counter pharmaceuticals. This is kind of another example of that. You also see joint ventures such as when GM and Toyota developed a factory plant in California. This was in the late 80s, early 90s, and they created a small car that was, in essence, the same product, and it was sold equally by Toyota and GM. So Toyota sold it as the Corolla, and GM sold it as a Chevrolet Nova. And the ironic thing is, the interesting thing is that bolt for bolt, they were the exact same car, and guess which one you would think would sell more? Naturally, Toyota did, because they were known for their building of quality cars. But, it didn't mean that GM suffered. The next is diversification growth. And this is when there are opportunities that exist outside of your present businesses that you wish to be able to be a part of. And so the example, of course, if we're looking at it, comes from Disney and Disney's desire and ability to not only buy ESPN and ABC, but then to purchase the intellectual properties, the IP of Star Wars and Marvel. I think those are examples of that ability to grow out above and beyond those particular organizations. Excuse me, folks. I couldn't see that. the last thing to recognize is that, quite simply, the last step is for organizations to accept that they may need in the process what is known as the golden parachutes. And these are the willingness to divest themselves and take off older businesses that are taking up needed resources for other units. And so, as an example, let me give you Ford in 2005, 2006. Now, when Ford was taken over by Alan Mulally, who came in from Boeing. Great story about that I'll relate sometime. Alan Mulally, when he became CEO of Ford in 2005 and 2006, one of the things that he did was he started changing the culture inside of Ford. One of the things that he recognized is that, quite simply, Ford had too many different corporations than when they went into the buying fringe or in the buying frenzies in the 90s. Ford had Jaguar, Ford had Land Rover. They had multiple corporations that, quite simply, added no value to the core of what Ford was. And so the first thing that Alan Mulally did was he sold those divisions, and ultimately it brought Ford such value to refocus itself on the things that they did well, that before Alan Mulally left, I believe in 2011, he was able to create another automobile division called Lincoln, and which is going on even at this time now. And so this is an example of divesting, which they did, and then ultimately going to a intensive growth, into an intensive growth by creating a new product development, by creating a whole new automobile organization. Now, how was he able to do this? Mostly he was able to do this by changing the organizational culture. Now, it's interesting that you would think that changing the culture is ultimately what help the organization, but there's no doubt that it did. An organizational culture is the structures and the policies, and many times those things can be dysfunctional, especially over time. And so a great example is the Ford Motor Corporation. When they were looking for a CEO in 2004, 2005, they needed fresh blood. All right, and Alan Mulally was on the market right now. Alan Mulally is a very interesting guy. He was an engineer with Boeing. He was part of the engineering group that created the first digital cockpit. He was an individual who was known as being on the move, and he was up for the CEO of Boeing but didn't get it in 2004, and Ford saw their opportunity and snapped him up to Ford's ultimate success and Boeing's fortunate dysfunctionalism, which you can see Boeing's going through in some of that right now. So one of the first things he did is that when he came and realized that Ford Motor Corporation is an organization that's been around for 100 years, is that there was a culture where the middle managers in the Ford Motor Corporation, let's say operations on one side and shipping is on another. If I was an operations manager and I was not as high up on the tree as another manager was, let's say in shipping, I couldn't contact that shipping manager directly. And that was something that had been built up over the organizations for decades. Alan Mulally wiped that out. Did away with that from the very first. The next thing that he started looking at was the particular parts that go into making automobiles. Now, one of the things that he noticed that was in all of the vehicles, there were 29 different radiators that were in Ford automobiles. Do you know how many radiators Toyota makes? One. All right. One of the things that he started was a 5-year plan to start in essence, standardizing parts. And what that did was it brought the overall cost of all automobiles down, and it made repairs on those vehicles much less expensive as well. It was a win-win situation. He was able to change Ford into a successful corporation by changing the culture in which those individuals worked in. So, the corporate culture is the shared experiences, stories, beliefs, and norms that characterize the organization. And what he did was he brought Ford into the modern age. It should also be noted that in 2009, when the automobile corporations were accepting money from the government, Ford refused. Al and Mulally refused to accept any money, and he actually made that as part of their marketing campaign to great success. So, along with all of these particular unique discussions is the need to find ways for imaginative ideas in strategy and in products, ways for those ideas to bubble up into the organizations. Senior management needs to find some way for innovation to make its way through ultimately the organization to the very top. We need youthful, we need diverse perspectives. We need to have employees removed from the company headquarters, getting away from the corporate structure to be able to have the specialness of these things kind of bubble up. Okay? We're going to talk about innovation. We talk about new product development and how important innovation is later. But I want to talk about innovation and how it drove this century of innovation that we have now, okay? And so the century of innovation that has been part of where we are today needs to be spoke about, and I'm talking about the century of the 19th century, not the 20th, okay? So, what do I mean? Well, the 19th century is just as fascinating as the 20th century is. We're right on the heels of the Industrial Revolution with everything that it's brought from Great Britain and all across Europe and all across the world. We're actually having automobiles that are driven on streets now. But the fascinating thing, of course, is that automobiles were only thought of as like playthings for the rich. And if you read this little caption under here with these two ladies that are in the car, it says, "There's no question in my mind that the auto girl is a worthy end of the century institution, but she'll never be so numerous as her sisters, the bicycle girl and the golf girl. It costs money, and lots of it, to follow the new craze." And that's what automobiles were thought about. They were thought about as a craze. Well, at that time, there were all of these individuals that were working in shops, building all of these unique things, coming up with great ideas in how to expand the uses of these horseless carriages, as they were known. And to his success, I think if we look right now, we have to owe a debt to Henry Ford. And Henry Ford was the one who said that failure is only the opportunity to more intelligently begin again. Ford was bankrupt twice before he created the Model T. Ford was an individual who may not have been necessarily a great engineer, but he was definitely a great marketer. And that's something that has to be stated. Okay, Ford had this idea. Ford had this idea that he wanted to make an automobile that was equal to the average salary of the American worker at the time. The average salary in 1906 was $500. And so he wanted to be able to sell a car for under $500. If you look back in these 19th century vehicles, $2,250. This was in, I believe, 1890 or 1892, this 4-passenger coupe. That's equivalent to the price of an individual's salary for 5 to 10 years. It was out of the scope of the average individual, but what Ford's vision was, is he felt that every individual should be able to, every family should be able to own an automobile. And so that's what he did. And he tried certain ideas at first and he failed. And then the truth is that he understood in his own heart that as successful as he was, he didn't have the expertise to really pull it off. All right, I mean engineering wise. Well, there was a corporation out there called by Henry LeLand that was called the LeLand, and they were making these great automobiles that were engineering marvels. And there were two brothers who actually worked for this corporation that Ford felt like he needed to find a way of getting them to help. And these individuals were not only building them, but they actually had their own factory as well. And so they were building LeLands out of the factory that they had made. And so Ford finally persuaded them to go and start producing for him. Now, LeLand had all of these automobiles, but he didn't have the engineers, and so he didn't know what to do. Well, he went out and hired good engineers. He continued with good engineering firms, and he named the corporation in honor of the Native American chief who had founded that area, and he named the car Cadillac. And so this is where Cadillac comes from Henry LeLand and these incredible engineers that work for his corporation. And these engineers actually happen to be brothers, and their names were Horace and John Dodge. They're fascinating folks, let me tell you. Horace and John Dodge were the brothers of immigrants. They came from as hard scrabble a life as you can expect. They're tough, burly, brawly individuals. They were loyal to each other almost to excess. If you notice on the picture here, you see that they look like they're wearing the same suit. Well, they did. They actually wore the same suit. They would not read any letters that were not addressed to both brothers together at the same time. They rose through the ranks. They became expressively wealthy. The hoity-toity people in Detroit didn't take to them because these were just, the hoi polloi. They came up the hard way. They didn't accept them into Detroit society until they went ahead and bought the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. And then they figured, well, yeah, I guess if they're buying an orchestra, I guess we'll let them be in. Just amazing stuff. So there's a little clip here, and this actually was a Dodge commercial. And I like this clip because the truth is that these were kind of like how the brothers are. So let me just run this little clip for you. I hope you can hear it. I don't know if you heard that or not, but it's really a great commercial. It just shows you they were brothers, like all brothers. You fight with each other, but you know what? nobody counts as much as you as a brother does. They were really innovators in their factories too. They created their own skunk works inside the manufacturing plants. They allowed the individuals to go in there and create, and whenever their people in there created, they gave them a piece of what they made. They employed a full-time doctor at their factories. They fed the workers there. In other words, every lunch was a sandwich and beer or something like that. So they were really progressive individuals in their time. And so basically, they had this plant, and so Ford was desperate, all right? He needed to find someone to help him. And so John and Horace Dodge came together, and they created, or they helped to create, the Ford Model T. They're the ones who put where the steering wheel was, which became standardized. They're the ones that helped develop the rear and front suspensions, and they, in essence, helped create it. And then for the first 5 years, they're the ones who built 1/3 of all of the Model Ts that ever came out. Now, Henry Ford had his own things as well. Ford wanted to be able to make this automobile, and he needed to find a way of being able to do it efficiently. Well, one of the things that he saw was at the World Exposition in 1896 in Chicago, was he saw a demonstration of the Chicago slaughterhouse, believe me, of all things. They watched how meat packers, the way that they were able to do their job was that the individuals at each station stayed where they were, and the conveyor belt moved the pieces from one place to the next. And so Henry Ford didn't develop the assembly line, he developed the conveyor belt. And what that helped to do was it helped him to standardize the work that they did. Another thing that he did was he brought standardized parts to the automobile industry. At that point, parts or automobiles intended to be almost what you would call match weapons. In other words, they were unique. Each one was built to their own specifications. Well, in the 1840s and 1850s, you found gun manufacturers like Smith & Wesson coming up with standardized parts, because the advantage of having 3 broke weapons on the field and you being able to pull parts from that weapon and in essence get another working weapon was vitally important. So Henry Ford brought that innovation to his plants, and then the last thing he did was he raised the salaries of the individuals who worked at their plants from $6 a day to $8 a day. Doesn't sound like much, but you're talking about a 25% increase in salary. It created a whole group of skilled workers who were so much better, did so much more. They were geniuses, all right? Now, the sum lesson of what I'm trying to teach you is this, is that Henry Ford didn't come up with the factory and then create the $500 automobile. What Henry Ford did was he first envisioned the $500 automobile, and everything came after that, all right? And so the goal is always the big picture. It is the vision that ultimately creates all of the tactical ways that you achieve success. And I want you to remember that in anything that you pursue, it is always the big vision is ultimately the things that creates the data activities that make that successful. Now, there's a sad end to the John and Horace Dodge story. I think it was Horace died 100 years ago because of the pandemic that happened then. The 1920 and 1921 pandemic. Yeah, I know it's a sad story. Yeah, one that we all might be visiting. They had sold their stock in Henry Ford's factory because Henry Ford quite simply couldn't stand the John and Horace Dodge making his automobiles, and he sold it. They sold it at something to the effect, I forgot, it was like $10 to $15 a share. They made $27 million in $1919 off of that sale. Think about that, folks, which made, them equivalent for half billionaires now. Eventually, their family, John and Horace Dodge's family, got out of the automobile business in 1927. Pretty smart if you think about the Depression coming around the roll for, I believe, $65 million at the time. And so it brought us to where we are now. So the one thing I want to just come up with this discussion that I'm having is just to give you an idea how innovation spurred success along the way. And that innovation is critical, not only because it brings new products to consumers in a way they may not have thought of, but it changes everything, all right? And so if you're looking to succeed and you're looking to, in essence, break the status quo, you do those by innovations. All right, so we're not going to worry about that, about the strategic planning process, as to worry about this particular important thing known as the SWOT analysis. Now, if you're in a graduate class, you will be doing SWOT analysis till you're blue in the face. You might as well accept that, all right? The SWOT analysis came about at Stanford University in 1962, and the SWOT analysis is a way of basically putting together a snapshot of where a corporation is and being able to take specific facts about a situation and grouping them to where they are in an overall strategic thought, okay? So what does SWOT analysis stands for? It is the letters strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, okay? So that's what a SWOT analysis is. If you notice, the strengths and weaknesses are internal to the organization. The opportunities and the threats are external to the organization. The strengths and weaknesses are micro in economics. In other words, they deal with individual facets inside the organizations themselves. The opportunities and threats are macroeconomic. They deal with the overall political and industrial environment in which the corporations are working in. Many times the opportunities are things that are available for everyone, and the threats, they at the same time may be things that are impossible or unable for the corporations to make any effect with. So why do we do SWOT analysis? Well, SWOT analysis first are easy to understand. Any individual can take facts and they can put them together with a way of taking information that comes in a study and plugging those into places. The next thing that a SWOT analysis does is, by putting together all of the salient facts, they help us to consider how do we go about taking our opportunities and turning them into successes. How do we deal with the facts that we have as evidence? How do we minimize the weaknesses that we might have? And how do we maximize the threats? Okay? So, SWOT analysis, strengths and weaknesses, internal and micro in economic, opportunities and threats, external and macro. Okay? If we're to talk about what a marketing opportunity is, it is an area of buyer need and an interest that a company has that has a high probability of profitably satisfying. There is a possibility out there in the market that we're able to be able to satisfy, and that opportunity needs someone to come along and provide some success towards. Microsoft knew about the iPad coming out a full year before it actually did. Microsoft had their own answer to the iPad coming out sometime, or had the possibility of coming out 6 months before the iPad actually came out. and they declined to come out. Why? Because the tablet that they had envisioned, they feared that it would damage the environment for Microsoft Windows because it was a different and unique operating system. They did not take advantage of that opportunity, and of course Google and Apple did, and ultimately it lends itself to where they are now. A threat is in the environment, whether it is legal, political, or industrial. It is a challenge posed by an unfavorable trend. In the absence of any kind of marketing action, could lead to lower sales or profit. And certainly, with the downsizing of the equipment that we were using from desktops to laptops to the natural progression to be pads and then ultimately smartphones, you could see that this overall environmental threat was not going to go away. And yet Microsoft chose to ignore it at that time, ultimately to their own detriment. Strengths are those things that happen in internal environment, those things that give us enormous advantages that are not easily copied by other organizations, whether it is corporate culture, whether it is intellectual property, whether it is specialized skills. All of those are what are considered strengths in the organizations, okay? Weaknesses can exactly be the same thing, but they are to the detriment of the organization. Excuse me. An example is a weak corporate structure in which innovation cannot find its way through. A lack of new talent could be another one as well. That's, in essence, in the internal environment, difficulties that reduce our ability to achieve some form of success. Now, one of the last things that we're going to talk about is a concept that Michael Porter came up with many years ago. And basically what they said is that there's really three generic strategies that are a good starting point for any organization when they're considering strategic thinking. So basically what he said is that if you boil down all of the companies and organizations that are out there at any one time, they usually come down to three generic strategies. Overall cost leadership, which is when firms work to have the lowest production and distribution costs so that they can underprice competitors and win a market share. That's first. The next is differentiation, when the business concentrates on achieving some superior performance with an important customer segment. And then finally, a business focus, in which a corporation focuses on one or more very narrow subjects and gets to know them very intimately and pursues them, with anything as being their target segment, okay? Usually those firms, they coming up with those thoughts in one way or another. If I were to look at overall cost leadership, and if I were to look at it with a distributor in mind, certainly I would think of Walmart. While they don't develop products and they don't have production, certainly their supply chain strategy is superior to everyone. And that the fact is that those goods have achieved a certain lower prices over the decades has lent them advantages that can't be duplicated in other ways. In terms of differentiation, I would kind of think of Apple. Certainly, if you were to look at tablets in general, all right? Tablets in general, or in PCs, if you look at that, the average margins are around 6 to 10%. If I were to look at a MacBook, or if I were to look at an iPad, the margins on those are 35%. Those are huge margins, okay? But because they achieve a certain superior performance, they can ask for that cost and they can get it, all right? And then the last is a particular focus on a particular narrow market segment. There's a couple of 3 organizations I can think of. If you think of perhaps Under Armour at the very beginning, that would be a good business to think of. When Under Armour started out, they had a unique kind of shirt that was used what was called anti-wicking. And one of the things about being an athlete, if you're wearing a cotton shirt, as you sweat, what happens is the sweat collects in the shirt itself, and it can cool you off, and actually cool you off faster than you need to. And it can make you discomfortable, and it can ultimately lead to fatigue. What the technology of those particular Under Armour did was it, in essence, drew the moisture away from the body. It allowed the body to cool naturally, and not only that, but it flipped on the other side. They were outstanding, especially in cold weather as well, because one of the difficulties in cold weather is that you freeze too fast. And so, no matter where you are, generally, in some point in time, you might consider that one of these, that you gradually kind of reduce yourself or go or find yourself in one of these particular directions. Okay? So finally, I'm going to end with this quote from Peter Drucker, in that it is more important to do the right thing and many times than to do things right. And so what he's basically stating is that the corporation's fit must be equal to the environment in which they live in, because eventually what will happen is that the environments change faster than the corporations themselves can. And so organizations can be changed through strong leadership, but there has to be a willingness to change the environment and adopt new goals and behaviors when you find the old ones are not going to be sufficient. So I talked about Cadillac once again, and I think the interesting thing about Cadillac wasn't that they were going to a new mission, but they were reclaiming their old one. And in finding their past, Cadillac ultimately found their future. All right, so the discussion about the marketing plan is not necessarily important, and we're going to leave it there. And so now we are finished with Chapter 2. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.